Everybody hear me?
Yes.
I feel honored to be given the job of delivering the keynote address. And it's with great humility that I stand here in front of the monument and over the crypt that contains the remains of the prisoners that lost their lives in the British ships in Wallabout Bay. And I want to devote what I have to say to who I call the heroes. No, these are not martyrs. These are the heroes that made this monument and this mausoleum and this crypt possible. They did so under great odds, sometimes actual opposition from various forces which were only too anxious to forget about the prisoners who were losers. And just like the Battle of Brooklyn was a loser, is why we don't really, most school children in America never heard of it and never heard of this monument. And therefore, I want to give a brief history. As soon as the final English ships departed from New York, 2 years after Yorktown, the prisoners were all gone from the ships, and already people start saying they should have a memorial. And already some of the prisoners were writing about their stay, the ones who survived, the stay above the prison ships, and most of the nation was horrified. And in 1824, there was one man who proposed a monument. The fact that he was a party other than the Federalist Party meant that the Federalists were against him from the beginning, because there was no rapport then, just as there is now, between the two parties. But slowly the movement gathered some momentum as these stories of the incarceration began appearing in the press and in books. And the Society of Cincinnati is composed of officers of the Revolution. They got into the act, and they thought they wanted a statue of George Washington as part of the memorial, and they thought they could put that over a crypt that would hold the bones of the dead prisoners. And that didn't get too far, but what gave it really impetus was the fact that the Tammany Society entered the scene. And a leader of Tammany was a man named John Jackson, who owned considerable land around what is now the Brooklyn Navy Yard. As a matter of fact, he sold his land to compose what became Navy Yard, and he donated space somewhere down near the Navy Yard, and he said, I will build a tomb there. I'll donate land. It's called Tomb of the Martyrs. And with great fanfare, this is about 1808, they had tremendous funeral processions, two of them, one to dedicate the site and one to dedicate the cornerstone of what would be the tomb. At least 20, 30,000 people thronged New York as they marched down the streets of New York, starting from what is now City Hall, and they then came in ships or ferries over to what essentially near the Navy Yard where this tomb was. And they played Yankee Doodle Dandy. They had dignitaries from all over the states nearby. They had 13 coffins representing prisoners from all the states, and they even had a tomb, the Wallabout dead prisoners, that was composed, a march composed specifically for the occasion. It was a gala time, but then when it came to raise money for the monument that would go over the tomb, they faltered, and they couldn't raise the money. And believe it or not, nothing much happened for 40 years. And at that point, and they built, by the way, it's almost what looks like in pictures, a shack over the tomb that was vandalized many times. And more or less everyone forgot about it for a while. And then there was a man named Walt Whitman, who was the editor at that time of the Brooklyn Eagle, together with a man called General Jeremiah Johnson. They formed a committee to start again, to get funds to build a monument. And they almost succeeded, but unfortunately Whitman lost his job as editor of the Eagle because he advocated anti-slavery, and Johnson died, and so the movement died. And then it wasn't revived. This was in the 1840s. It wasn't revived again until the 1860s during the Civil War. And then this area around here became a very desirable area. Some of the richest people in America lived on Clinton Hill, people with names like Pratt and Underwood. And they decided to do something. So they hired the designers of Prospect Park, Calvert Bow, and Frederick Law Olmsted to design this park and to put it around a mausoleum. The mausoleum was built and around 1860, and they transferred the bones. They had a little legal problem getting the bones from the original place because some of the old Tammany people refused to give them up. But they finally did, and they transferred without any fanfare the bones from there to here. And incidentally, the last Tammany man who held on to the bones said he wanted to be buried with them, and he was when he died. And then it went into decline again because there was actual opposition on the part of people who said, let bygones be bygones. Let sleeping dogs, no matter how awful, lie. The problem was that the English-speaking colonists in America thought they should bond with their fellow Englishmen in England, and they should unite against what they considered the competition from peoples from Asia and Africa, and they thought that doing this bonding, they would have to forget about the enmity they once had toward England. And then, in 1880, the Society of Old Brooklynites was formed. At the time, you had to be 40 or 50 years resident in Brooklyn to be a member. And they took up the subject of the monument to be built over the mausoleum. And 8 years later, they sent a petition to Congress. It contained the names of 8,000 of the prisoners that were recorded as being on the Jersey, one of the most notorious of the prison ships. Supposedly, according to accounts, the petition they gave was 3 miles long. How this could be, I don't know, but that's what it said. And they sent this list of the prisoners to every single Congress. It got to a certain point of completion, but they needed help, and they got it from the Daughters of the American Revolution, which was a national organization and could produce far more input from a lobbying point of view. But even they couldn't swing the money from Congress to build this monument. But finally, they had some enterprising people. Oh, and many other organizations joined it, and they started an association, the prison ship Martyrs Association of the United States, which was an omnibus organization of not only the DAR and the Sons of the Society of Old Brooklynites, but also a half a dozen other organizations joined, mostly like Sons of the Revolution. And then, from their point of view, a very fortuitous situation developed when they discovered near the Navy Yard the remains of 100 different prisoners that had been buried there. And using this as a publicity wedge, they put so much pressure on Congress that 2 years later, Congress donated $100,000 to help fund this monument on the condition that the local people and the DAR and the Society of Old Brooklynites raised the other $100,000, which they did without too much trouble. And we all know what happened then. We celebrated last year the 100th anniversary of the unveiling of the monument. And they took this money and they hired Stanford White to design the memorial, which you see in back. And so it seemed, and then they had President-elect William Howard Taft, who surprisingly, for his sort of gentle manner, really lit in his speech, which he gave 101 years ago on the spot. He lit into the British, and he said it's true that although a lot of people think that the British deliberately tried to kill the prisoners, something that many people believe, he said, I don't think that's true, but in the long run, what they did had the same effect. And anyway, after that fanfare, which was widely reported in the press, everything deteriorated as far as popularity of this monument. What had happened was the desire to become affiliated with the other English-speaking country, England, was so great that they started to deny what the prisoners had written about what took place there. They said that these prisoners had exaggerated. Ethan Allen, who spent time in prison and wrote some of the horrible things there, they more or less called him a liar. There was one man named Van Dyne who made a career out of saying that everything bad said about the British was wrong. He claimed to have researched it thoroughly. And he gave a speech to that effect in Parliament, no less. And then by 1914, when England got in war with Germany and we helped them, by that time the bond with England had become so great that everyone forgot about the Martyrs here. And then, not until the end of the century, until very recent years, when you have our elected officials in the council and in the Senate, they're in the House of Representatives, raise money, the Parks Department helped, and last year you saw the light at the top lit for the first time in about 50, 60 years. And this year we're starting out in fine fashion. Just in the last week or so, Congress funded $300,000 more to fix up this area. And then a book came out last year, which I recommend to anyone interested in the prison martyrs. The book is Forgotten Patriots by Professor Edwin, the name Burroughs of Brooklyn College, who wrote, as far as I know, the only definitive book about the prisoners, not only here, but the prisoners in other prisons in Manhattan and in other areas. It's a marvelous book, and it goes into detail. I would say half of the book is devoted to the prison martyrs. And before we get too complacent, however, before we rest on our laurels, I think we have a job to do. Professor Burroughs called it Forgotten Patriots. So I don't think the job is to remember, but the job is to communicate to the world about New York and Brooklyn's role in the revolution. When you think of the revolution, you think of the bigwig founders in Philadelphia who were drafting the Constitution. We think of the rebel hotheads in Massachusetts that ignited the revolution. But no one thinks of Brooklyn and New York. And Brooklyn, for the first battle of the war and the biggest battle involving the most troops, all took place here, and nobody knows. I venture to say there are thousands of people within a mile of here don't know what this statue is. And I mentioned that all over the country, school children are not taught anything. So this is a challenge we have. Just as we had the challenge to build the monument in the first place, we have the challenge to spread the word. And this is possible. There have been several things proposed, that we make this a military cemetery, that we have honor guards on the weekend. And this is something that we could do, particularly now the technology of the media is great. And so I look forward to working on this myself, and I hope all of us do, that we spread the word that these prison martyrs have not died in vain.